Well, hello again, and thanks once more for taking the time to tune in to my YouTube channel, where we now take a look at yet another vintage off-road machine here in my little world of classic dirt bikes. Now in this featured video we will be taking a look at this very nice and quite original 1979 Montesa 250 Cappra twin shocker. Now I have already posted a short clip on this particular bike, although this time round we will take a more detailed look and try and give you a bit more background information on what is essentially a very nice and genuine machine from 1979. Now the current owner told me that this bike had been mothballed and had been laid up in the previous owner's workshop for many years before he then found the bike and subsequently then purchased it. And these pictures and video clips were taken just prior to the new owner taking the bike for its first ever race outing in 2018. Now we're not saying for a minute that this is a 100% original machine from 1979, but there are only a couple of parts on this particular bike that don't qualify as making it an original bike, but nevertheless it's still a very smart looking example of one of these lovely 250 Montesa Cappras. Now the motor of course is a 1979 250 piston port 2-stroke with a bore and stroke of 70 by 64 millimeters. Now the big end and small ends of the crankshaft on these machines ran on needle roller bearings, while the crank itself ran on a much larger roller bearing affair. Now the cylinder is of course alloy construction, but has a cast iron liner shrunk into it, and the piston is also fitted with a single Dykes piston ring. Now these serrated cylinder cooling fins were specifically designed to improve the temperature of the little two-stroke motor and help to alleviate the heat build-up when the engine was worked hard on the racetrack. Now of course the fuel was fed to the motor by this Spanish-made 54mm Bing carburetor, which were decent enough items, although riders did tend to change these for other manufacturers' carbs to try and improve the power and performance of the 250 motor. Now the front forks were 35mm Mersockis, which were oil filled as you would expect and were okay by 1979 standards, and the top of the suspension units were also fitted with air caps in order that you could add compressed air to fine tune the damping of the forks. But in reality it was a pretty basic setup as far as motocross suspension goes. Now as opposed to the rear shocks, Montesa machines from 1979 were normally fitted with a set of beater rear shocks, although these were only good enough really to hold the rear of the bike up while it was sitting in the showroom waiting to be sold. But later Montesa then changed to these Italian Corticosa units, which were slightly better than the old beater units, but still were not the best for off-road riding. Now the Montesa's fuel tank was one of the better ideas from the Spanish company. It was of course made from plastic with a useful 1.5 gallon capacity with a nice stubby kind of shape, and definitely looked the part on this 1979 frame. And of course this particular 1979 bike still has its original fuel cap from that period, which of course is a very rare thing on a bike of this vintage. Now, one of the other plus points on this 79 Montesa was this very plush and very comfortable rider's seat, which of course, as many motocrossers will tell you, is a must on a motocross bike, especially when you're riding these on bumpy racetracks. Now, the original parts continue on this bike, as this machine still has its 1979 exhaust and tailpipe, and by all accounts this bike has not seen much action, as it looks in almost brand new condition, and we'll have an opportunity to hear this little machine in action nearer the end of the video. Now, both the front and rear mudguards are also the original Montesa items and come complete with this Montesa motif stamped on them. But back in the day, Montesa riders used to complain that this front mudguard was never long enough for its purpose, and riders used to get splattered in mud and other debris while riding on the track. But of course, making these little 250 Montesas go was just one thing, but making them stop was another. Now, the front and rear drum brakes were what can only be described as adequate for their time, but really you had to think ahead to give you enough time to plan your next stop when using these drum brakes. Now, these 79 bikes were fitted with a 21-inch front wheel and an 18-inch rear. Now, this was about the standard for motocross machines of the time, but what is extremely rare in this bike's particular case is that it still has its original Acront alloy wheels, as you can see here. Now, the final drive chain transmission is of course kept in tension by use of this lovely silent block swing arm alloy in a rubber chain guide, which of course is near the final drive sprocket. Now, the engine had an 11-tooth primary sprocket and a rather large 50-tooth one at the business end, but mind you, in our particular case, this machine has been fitted with a 56-tooth final drive sprocket. Now, as I mentioned earlier, while most parts on this bike are still original items from 1979, one of the pieces that are not original are these rental bars, and of course its associated bar pad. Now, the owner did insist that apart from these, most of the rest of the bike is still in its original condition from 1979. Now, the current owner never had much to do with the transformation of the bike other than fitting a new set of handlebars, but other than that, the bike was still in very good condition from back in the day. Now, this bike still has its original end caps on the swinging arm spindle, which is a very rare item to see on one of these 250 Montesas from 1979. Now, much of the plastics, of course, including these lovely side panels, are still the original items for this 250cc machine. Now, in 1979, these 250 Montesas had a reputed overall weight of just around 250 pounds, which was quite comparable to many of the other motocross machines that were available at the time. Of course, in 1979 you would have been expected to pay around £1,150 for one of these 250 Montesa bikes, which was a decent price considering there were many much cheaper and some would even say better off-road machines available at the time. Nevertheless, although despite some of these previously mentioned pitfalls of this 1979 250 Montesa, in general it was still a decent little bike and could be a very competitive little machine if the rider was on his game and worked the little 250 motor's socks off in a race situation. So there we have it, a very nice classic from 1979, a good, almost original bike that is still being used as a twin-shock racer at many vintage and classic race events. So we've seen the bike and talked about it in brief detail, so all that's left is to listen to what she sounds like. This video was brought to you in association with World Sport, the world's #1 supplier for all your off-road and leisure sportswear. Just visit their online website for more details.